Strife of the Mighty, Book 1 of the Chronicles of Randolin, being the first volume of the Leo Chronicles. Prologue, The Jaws of Despair. Neither moon nor star pierced the black covering of clouds that had drifted down from the nearby mountains, thick and heavy with rain. What had started out as a light breeze had now become a fierce wind. It bowed the tops of the trees, promising a coming storm. Under this shadowed canopy of the night sky fled a lone horse and rider, like mist before a gale, bound in a deadly race. Nigh upon them a great shape wraved through the darkness, bounding through the gloom like some phantom shadow of horror. With each leap, the sign of its passing was made as its massive bulk pressed the marks of great paws into the earth. Fell glared the light of its eyes, an ill red that seemed to hue the dull crimson of its hide. Its true name remembered only by the elect. Men spoke of this terror by the name their forefathers had taught them to fear, Gragmar. The rider's horse frothed, mad with terror, driven on by a single overwhelming instinct, escape. The forest through which the horse fled loomed densely, thick as a black shroud, and the man on its back, with sword and arm, was forced to strive with the clutching fingers of groping branches. Beneath him, his panic-stricken charger was ungovernable, giving no heed to the pulling of its rider. It fled on, straight through the night's black. Though the man's peril was great indeed, he was not yet mastered by fear. Glancing swiftly rearward, he assessed the closing distance between himself and the creature with a grim strain, and then again returned his attention to the way of flight. He had been in greater plights. In his right hand he clutched a bow, and though but 5 arrows remained in the quiver strapped to his saddle, he raised it to his defense. The dread hunter trailed him closely, its swiftness inexorable. Eagerness burned in it as hotly as its wicked spirit. Weariness was gone. The creature trailed its prey as a silent form of red death, the command of its master and brood feeding its lust to rend flesh and devour bone. This night the man would not escape. He could sting far worse than most all the enemies of its master, but he was wearied from a journey, and diminished from a previous ambush. In this hour the monster stood a chance. At that moment the rider let fly an arrow, nothing more than an annoyance to the beast. This he knew, but he needed distance. He did not even pause to aim at the great head, for its skull was as sturdy as any armor, a buckler of bone, and its body equally so. The feathered missile left the string with a whine of speed, barely piercing the height of the muscled shoulder into which it pricked. Once more a shaft was loosed. This time the Gragmar, swiveling to the side, evaded the dart, and the arrow sped off into the gloom. The distance between horse and horror grew shorter, every bound bringing predator nearer to prey. Yet again an arrow leapt from the string. Again the monster went to evade, but suddenly stumbling, it faltered for an instant, and the point of the dart caught a wolf-like ear. Unhindered, the shaft carried on, taking with it the piece of flesh. Dark blood stained its crimson jaw. The creature snarled, and then, with a burst of speed, brought the remaining distance to a close. It was now right at the horse's heels, with a massive paw and claws that matched any blade of steel. It swiped at the rear flank, or horse's scream rent the night, but the great monster missed by a hair's breadth. Now so near, it felt the pricking pain as the second to last arrow sank into the flesh of its massive neck. It was enough. Without a warning of any sort, it leapt, heaving its bulk off the ground with a little effort. With astounding swiftness, the rider rolled from the back of his doomed steed, bracing himself with his arms before meeting the sod. The force of the impact shoved the breath from his lungs and the bow from his hand, and sent him tumbling several feet before he came at last to a halt. The horse was less fortunate. The deadly claws had missed the man by no more than an inch, but the leap of the beast had yet not to end. The horse had not the speed to elude before the heralding lightning of the approaching storm had come to send its report across the sky. There came a rending crack under the trees, sharp yet heavy, as the full weight of the hunter bore down on the horse, crushing the animal's back. The man leapt to his feet and stood, gazing at the dread form that now crouched over the body of his steed. They stood facing one another in still silence, and a red smoulder kindled in the eyes of the Cragmar. In the distance, the sky was suddenly lit as lightning sheared the clouds. A peal of thunder followed a moment later, as the rumbling stilled briefly. The man snorted. Another ambush. Then, with one deft movement, he drew his sword and pointed its edge at his foe. Unveiled, the white blade gleamed in the dark, an ember of snow in the blackness. The hell beast charged, saliva streaming, jaws open in rippling snarl. Tensely holding his ground, the man waited. Just before the impact, he leapt sideways, as the Cragmire slashed where only an instant before its enemy had stood. The rider bore down, his sword on the matted back. The tear did not rend deep, for though deadly was the two-edged blade, the precariously placed stroke was not enough to shear the congealed hide. Before another strike could rain, the creature's paw lashed out with terrifying speed, hurling the warrior aloft and into the trunk of a near tree. Even so, his weapon never left his hand. With a force that jarred him from head to foot, the rider collided. His foe gave him no time, but charged again before its opponent had risen. Willing strength into his battered limbs, the man forced himself to one knee and put forward his sword, its shining point outstuck. Of all the defense the monster had anticipated, this had been the least expected. Its huge claws tore the earth as it strove frantically to slow. Mere inches away from the point of the sword, it leapt aside. Nevertheless, the tip of the weapon pierced its hind leg, sinking deeper than any wound it had yet received, before the end of the leap bore it out of harm's way and into the undergrowth of the wood. The man scrambled to his feet and again turned to face his enemy, fighting against the fatigue and pain of his body. The Cragmire was wrathful, though now ever the more wary. Its injury was the price paid for casting away caution in eagerness. Its enemy was weary, but still a lethal foe. Changing tactic, it began to creep in a circle, using underbrush for concealment, so as to come on the prey from behind. Had the beast not been so intent upon stealth and its quarry, it would have scented the stranger before it met him. He sat on a stump between the Cragmire and the rider. In his hand was a bottle from which poured a most potent smell. A large lantern lay beside him, giving a faint light to the surrounding shadow. The stranger was facing in the opposite direction, apparently trying to gaze at something, when a sudden dread made him turn. When his eyes looked dark death straight in the face, he paled, the strength of his fright leaving him white as bone. He leapt to his feet, and at the same instant the monster sprang. It was an unfortunate move, for as the stranger jerked up in his haste, he dropped his liquor, spilling the drink onto the lantern. There was a hiss and a roar as flames sprang forth from the bottle. Almost at the same instant, the glass itself exploded in a flurry of heat and sharp fragments, all upon the underside of the airborne quagmire. The creature growled in surprise as the flames wreathed along its hide. Twisting violently in the air, it sought to shorten its jump, and a second later returned heavily to the earth. The stranger was already off, fleeing through the trees. A single scream tore from him, and he was gone. But the bursting fire had been of little harm. The fell hunter's power did not lie in strength alone. With a faint sound, like the whisper of a cold wind, the flames on the beast sputtered and went out. It whirled round again, and was met face to face with the rider's final arrow. The dart, hazed in a faint sheen of white, struck the creature between the eyes. At once, a sheet of silver light sprang up. The trees nearby were lit from ground to trunk, and the shadows fled as from the assault of daylight. The quagmire howled as the arrow began to burn its way into the bone of its face, the silver light searing its eyes with a fierce agony no weapon of steel could cause. Turning, it fled blindly, tearing through the underbrush and pawing madly at its muzzle. It was a short but excruciating moment later that it managed to pull the dart from its flesh, which turned to ash from head to shaft as soon as this was done. But by then the man was gone. Chapter 1. Beer and Gossip. Nestled in the southeastern corner of Randallin, in perhaps one of its most beautiful landscapes, was the village of Verilel. Verilel, where the Sabrin hill range still loomed, luscious in its yielding, where the last of the white deer descended from the once proud Uri from the wilds of the north, still frolicked and foraged in the secrecy of the surrounding woods, and where the most favoring peaches and apples of the land still grew in great abundance. Songs were sung in the town of Ikrand, especially in the summer, of the wonderful fruits that came down from the tops of the green hills that surrounded Verilel. The village itself was not an overly large place, yet it was fair and comfortable, and somehow fortunate enough to contain both a tavern and a small inn-house, as the inhabitants called it. Verilel was fenced, that is to say, that a wall encircled all its borders. It was not a wall of heavy fortification, but it did provide a certain amount of protection, if only to serve as peace of mind to those behind it. It was thus walled because the village itself, though settled in prominent calm, was also near to indefinite danger. Verilel was rather close to the Black Mountains, a mere 4 or 5 days' journey. It would not do to forget about such a place when one lived within such close proximity of its towering peaks. The Black Mountains had a sinister reputation, and were held in the minds of the inhabitants, not to say too much at present, to be quite a dangerous locality. Verilel's population count varied depending on the prosperity or decline of the times. The village itself held the lesser numbers of souls, the nearby hills and surrounding woods catering to the greater part of the inhabitants. The people of Verilel were a plain lot, being unaccustomed to the strifes of extremely stressful or dangerous life. They were friendly to one another, for the most part, helping with crop harvesting when the season came around, or lending a hand in a barn raising in the spring, or perhaps just donating friendly advice when the prospect of labor was not wished to be indulged. They were usually well-mannered enough to any travellers who happened by, but these were few. However, the Veruladans did possess a possible flaw. If a traveller did chance into town looking at all suspicious to them, or the least bit unfriendly, he would be shunned. Well, it would be untrue to say completely shunned. Business would still be conducted with him as long as the locals could collect a sum, but as far as the usual cordiality, there would hardly be any, and the newcomer would usually be kept an eye on by the villagers' children. On the day that this story continues, a great deal of the locals were gathered behind the large pinewood walls of the tavern, a worthy place, namely the Apple Sickle. It was early afternoon and raining hard outside. The falling water could be clearly heard as it cascaded ceaselessly off the roof of the hostelry, accompanied now and then by the flash of lightning and the boom of thunder. The talk being entertained was all about the events of the previous night. The watchmen had apparently seen and heard some very queer happenings in the late hours after dark, and were now relaying the said events to the village folk. Although they were few themselves, being locals, the watchmen had quite an audience, all eager to hear their tale. Supposedly, last night, in the brief space of quiet before the storm had rolled in, a queer noise had come down from one of the nearby hills, the scream of some animal in great fear, although this was not at first clear to the watchmen. After a brief debate, they had reasoned that it had sounded very much like a terrified horse, and since it did not seem to be approaching the village, they had decided that investigation would be best left till morning. Very soon, however, they were all gazing out over the wall again, for in the direction of the sound a bright flame had leapt into sight. It just appeared out of nowhere, one recollected, a rather short man with a bald head, like magic, and then in another moment it was gone, just like that. And then out of the woods that way, here comes old Madge Provender, and let me tell you, he was in a state, screaming like a child he was, and running so fast I doubt even old Quickfoot Sammy could have caught him. Ain't that right, William? That he was, Felden agreed, a tall, sandy-haired fellow. He ran right up to the gate and pounded on it with all his might, yelling for us to let him in. What happened? We asked, but all he kept shouting was, it's after me, over and over again. So we let him in. As soon as we did, he bolted off down the street, and we didn't see him again. I saw him, one of the listeners piped up. I was on my way home from Illan's when he passed me in the dark. He darted straight down to his house, and in his fright forgot that he never looks up. Half fell inside and shut the door. He hasn't been out since, so I've heard. Well, anyways, said Felden, giving a small dismissive wave of his hand. We stood looking on at the hilltop, when suddenly there comes another flash, brighter than a fire. Yes, sir, it lit up the forest as if morning had come early, and made my eyes smart, what's more. And following just behind that came a sound I've never heard nor want to ever hear again. A howl like the roar of some deathly creature from the nether beyond that chilled my blood like the breath of a ghost. So we're standing there, right speechless as you might guess, when we see this other fellow coming down from the top of the hill. He was dressed very strange like, all black hood and ragged leggings. He came on and on, and when he was close enough to hear us, we shouted at him. "Oi, stop," we say, and he stops. "What's your business here?" "I am not but a journey-worn traveller," he says, "who is only seeking a comfortable place to lay his head." "So you say," says we, "but how do we know that you aren't up to some form of mischief, eh? What did you have to do with what went on in the forest yonder?" The watchman proceeded to relay the story of how the man, using a very influent form of speech, told them of his arrival to the village and his brief trouble in the hills. He said that he had been in the Sabran Hill range now for some time, ostensibly trying to locate Verlel. He and his horse had just stopped for the night under the fire, he said, when from out of the wood stepped a stranger. He was drinking, and upon meeting the traveller, he proceeded to sit down by the fire and make himself comfortable. The two fell to chatting. At one point, the drinking man began regaling the other on family history, during which he came to a memory that he found quite fondly amusing. Laughter interrupted his tale, and as his mirth intensified, he made to slap his knee. "Instead of doing this," said the stranger, his unlikely companion, by that time quite embedded, brought his palm down on the flank of the nearby horse. The animal had tried to shy away, but had been tied, and so instead had reared, knocking its antagonist to the ground. The bottle had flown from his hand, flipped once in the air, and, by sheer bad luck, landed straight on the fire. I am sure that I do not have to tell you, gentlemen, how flammable a drink like that is, the watchman evoked with dramatizing quotation. So now my horse, greatly spooked by the flames, up and leapt into the air, but it turned a bit too far, and here we heard him sigh. The flames caught onto the hide of the poor beast. Thanks to that fall, I had to put the animal to rest. It was a shame, for I had owned him a long time. At any rate, I have now relayed my tale, for that, my kind sirs, is what I had to do with what went on in the forest yonder. Then we says to him, "The fellow that you say you met came running out of the woods yelling about something being after him. What was that?" He answers, "I suppose he thought my horse might have been after him. You must realize, sirs, that he was overfull." "Why'd your horse scream before the flame caught him, eh?" we asked. "Scream," he said, putting a question in the word. "He screamed only once, and that was because of the flames. But there was another noise. Did you hear it?" "I heard it, we did," said we. "What can ye tell us about it?" He should have shrugged then. "I don't know what to make of it, but I've no wish to meet whatever it is behind the sturdy wall of your village. I would feel much safer." Then we asked him where he was from, and he said away by Ikrin, but that he travelled a lot. "All right then," we says, "we'll let you in. We haven't had any of you Westerners here for a long while. Folk will be keen on hearing news of the open lands." So we opened the gate, and in he came. We pointed him to the Corpner's Inn, and off he went. We kept our eyes on him as long as we could, but then the rain set in, and we soon lost sight of him down the road. I think he's still there now, but I also think all of this is an odd happening. Someone ought to visit Murch and get his side of the story. "Didn't none of you ask him about the flash?" one of the listeners inquired. Falcon opened his mouth to say something, but then closed it, and scratched his head. He had been sure that he or one of his fellow watchmen had indeed asked about the mysterious flash of light, yet now that it had actually been mentioned, he could not exactly remember doing so. "I thought we did," he said slowly. "In fact, I'm sure we did, but I can't quite remember as to how he answered." That won't do, the listener retorted, who was none other than Toad Hardstiff from Hemlock Hill. Exploding whiskey bottles, a strange man, and mysterious flashes of light that you can't remember about. Sounds to me like you and all the rest had a drop or two more of the spirits than was good for you. Loud laughter broke out all around when this was said, and the watchman grew red in the face. And another thing, Teld went on. How come none of us didn't hear no howl last night like you say there was? Maybe because you snore too loud, Claw Ears, Felton retorted. You'd sleep through an avalanche that fell right by your ears. If you didn't believe us, then fine. If you don't believe us, then fine, I says. But you just go on, ask Merch about it, and see what he has to say. That trip ran the abusing fool, someone else shouted. Pah! You can't believe a word he says. Ever since he couldn't control his own craving for drink, never a sane word did I hear him speak. Be fair, yelled another person from nearby. His head isn't quite right, that's pretty true, but it's unwarranted to say that he's completely out of it. This voice belonged to a younger man who was leaning against the wall. The top of his head sprouted bushy brown hair, and his scantily haired jaw, slim and straight, served to define his green eyes. Ah, you're always looking for the best in people, Elon, the first shotter retorted. A burly man whose brightly colored hair matched his pale skin. But you've got to agree with me on this one. Merch Provender, loony as they come he is. It's bad luck always looking for the worst in people, Limbren, Alan muttered. I can't help it that stupid people make me laugh, Limbren said, with a grin. And I don't step on your toes because of your opinion of folk. Alan sighed. I'm not stepping on your toes, even though you insist on putting them in the way. What I'm getting at is that not all those as have made a mistake or two need be reminded of them all the time. Everybody in the area has their fair share of bad decisions, and those mistakes are always remembered in the family name. Take your own, for example, Farbrow, a name littered with half-decent choices and bad ones. Limbren rolled his eyes. Another one of Alan Bracken the Wiser's words. Oh, wisdom. Where do you get off as you should be telling me how to think, eh? As if your family name's spotless. It ain't forgotten by half the folk around that your father, old squint-eyed Harvey Bracken, did himself in for absolutely no reason under the sun. So said your grand-uncle Raggan Farnbrow, Alan said icily, the well-known thief. He was the only one near Harvey at the time of his death, and the story he told had a lot of gaps in it. He'd always liked my grandfather's silver studs, but hated the fact that Harvey wouldn't part with them. And the strangest thing was that when Harvey died, the studs themselves mysteriously disappeared. He stared coldly at Limbren, who returned his gaze with an indifferent expression. So what? Farbrow said, with a wave of his hand. Nothing was ever proven, except suicide. My granduncle always returned anything he borrowed. Oi, your parents, Alon, Avel, and Nirana, despised Farbrow till the day they died. They even sold their plot of land in the hills to the Dinholes and moved into the village itself just because my family happened to own a plot of land near him. You, being their only child and all, got the house after they bit the dust. Too lazy for a farmer's life you were. You ain't going to show the same spite, are ya? He flashed Emma Bracken a mocking grin, showing teeth of the unhealthiest colorations. But as I was saying about Merge, Blockhead Provender, I've no liking for fools, and if I say so, that's my affair. Here the large man paused to lift a flagon to his lips, and Alan noticed for the first time the rather excessive number of empty drinking vessels that lay about his table. After a long drought, the flagon in Limbrand's hand thumped down again, though with more force than was necessary. Alon, long since wearied of his argument, felt it high time to end the exchange. "Very well," he said, raising his hands. "It's true that I have no ground to be telling others as to how they should be living, but that was never my intent. Let's take it as a misunderstanding. No need to quarrel." "Who's quarreling but you?" Limbrand demanded, his eyes flashing suddenly. Alon frowned deeply, but kept his temper. With a shake of his head, he turned his back to Limbrand and headed for the bar. "Not so fast," shouted Farnborough, rising to his feet. "I think it's time you and me had a little talk, see? I've had it with your soft-headed," but he did not get to finish his sentence, for at that moment the tavern door swung open. Some of the people inside turned briefly to see who had entered, and when those who did fell quiet, their silence attracted the attention of others, who also turned to look. So all were watching as the stranger, framed in rain and dripping, crossed the threshold of the apple sickle. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see